So my question is just right, not really based on the presentation, but I feel I wanted to speak to the legal frameworks for Zambia, specifically the Loans and Guarantees Authorization Act. So probably we have seen that that act in its essence doesn't guarantee transparency when it comes to the date itself, and it also doesn't guarantee clear consultation from the public through those processes of engagement with the date. So how can we influence, what mechanisms do you probably see to be the most effective when it comes to engagement with members of parliament so that they can actually see into repealing and replacing of the act? Thank you.
My question is, I've got two questions actually. The first one is, what should be done to improve Zambia's debt crisis? And is it possible to avoid falling into a bigger debt crisis? Because mostly look at the fact that there are a lot of young people in the country at the moment, and many of them probably would like to participate in improving the economic conditions as well as trying to ensure that the debt crisis can be reduced. So what can we also do as young people? What would you suggest as young people we can do in our power to help improve the situation? And lastly, if Zambia is to come out of this debt crisis, what can we do to ensure that we have a sustainable flow of economic income to prevent such a thing from happening again? Thank you.
I want to find out from the Undersecretary General if she is hopeful that Zambia can get this IMF bailout, because the restructuring process that Zambia is going on is towards the IMF bailout. Is she hopeful that Zambia can get it, and if at all it can help maybe develop the country? Then secondly, I write at what Professor Nduro said about oversight by Parliament. Just 2 weeks ago, Cabinet approved the debt management bill, which is now going to Parliament. I just want to find out from the Undersecretary General, is she hopeful that if we have this oversight from Parliament, can it limit the amount of debt that the country can acquire, like we've seen in the last 10 years? Thank you very much.
So I'm working on a project that says, the title of the project is the Kwacha Sciatica. So we are looking at what could be the possible effects of the currency rebase on our currency's power as purchasing power parity index. So the coins, could it be that they have brought about more harm than they were supposed to have reduced the inflation that they were being talked about?
I'm Malik Silwenda from the University of Zambia School of Humanities Development Department. My question is, can the Brentwood institution come up with better and fair lending conditions to the third world countries away from the structural adjustment program? Yeah, according to my knowledge as a student who is doing development studies, I think structural adjustment programs is has impeded both economic growth and development among third world countries. And it is the main reason why most third world countries are still struggling with the issues of debt today. Thank you.
My name is Judith Liza Nasibebo. My question is on debt servicing. My question is, how do you look at situations where debt is gotten to service other debts? There are situations where people borrow money to service other debts. So is it something that you recommend? Is it a bad thing? How does it affect the economy of the country? That's my question. Thank you.
I think maybe let me start with Professor Nduro and a little bit of what he said, which I think links to some of the questions. In many countries that have done well, and one of the countries, of course, that I'm sure that you're tired of hearing comparisons with, try not to do that, but I'll do it now anyway, is Chile, right? Chile is a huge, commodity exporting economy, which one was able to diversify, as we said, and we gave the example of Guinea. But another thing that they have succeeded in doing, and Guinea is going a little bit in that direction, they're not fully there yet, is they have what you call fiscal rules. And one of the fiscal rules is essentially that it says, if you're going to introduce a spending item into the budget and even an investment item into the budget, you must demonstrate, one, the value of that in terms of, and that goes back to this issue of rates of return, But in some countries, it is even more stringent. And for a while in Chile, it was that stringent. They've relaxed it now because of social pressures. It was you could not introduce new spending if you were not suggesting what to take out. And this is the whole conversations around what we call contestability of budgets, right? So essentially, in many of our countries, what we tend to see is the Minister of Finance says revenue to GDP is going to be 20%, even though it has never been 20% for the last 3 decades. But when we take the budget to Parliament, we say it's going to be 20%. The reason being that if you say that revenue to GDP is going to be 20%, then expenditures can be 24% because you're within a deficit of 4%, which is what the IMF gives you. By the time the year is over, revenue to GDP is only 15% and even in some cases 8%. And essentially you've spent a lot more, but ministers of finance want to go to Parliament and tell parliamentarians that they can raise more revenue so that every parliamentarian can have a pet project. So the fiscal rule becomes a really important tool to constrain everybody, to ensure that you have this contestability process. In some countries, it's actually contestability within the particular department. So if a transport minister wants to introduce a new transport project, he has to offer a transport project that he's taking away or revenues in the transport sector that he's going to collect to fund the project. That begins to create a lot more accountability within segments and this is why we have the Young Economists Network, because we want young economists like yourselves to be able to start having these conversations when the budget is going to Parliament. And this is the next question that was asked, I think, by Ruben, on legal instruments. Legal instruments are great, but they are only as good as the oversight that is used of them, right? So even if you have a law, if nobody uses the law, then the law is useless. And so essentially, if we have, a young economist like yourselves, as the budget is being proposed, beginning to write about it, beginning to talk about it, beginning to engage with the budget, I think that begins to spread knowledge and conversations around it. In many countries where you have a debt management framework as well, and these are linked, in most countries that have fiscal rules also have debt management frameworks. Essentially, the debt management framework is one of those tools as well, because it keeps you within a debt to GDP ratio, within a public debt service to GDP ratio, within a reserves ratio, to ensure that you can honor all your obligations. And so debt management rules essentially tell you if Zambia had a good debt management office, for example, you wouldn't have the kind of exposure that you have as a developing country where you only have almost only 10% of your debt as concessional debt, right? And a lot of your debt, which is much higher than your rate of growth. You cannot be borrowing in markets where the cost of debt is higher than your rate of growth. A debt management rule would essentially make that impossible if, again, the rule is observed. So I think those are the kinds of things. It's one thing to have a rule, is another thing to have oversight of the rule, and that's where your audit institutions become important, but also you as civil society. I think the next question was around what can we do to improve the debt? So there's a stock and flow problem, right? The stock is what you have today and what you have to do with what you have today. And then there is a flow, which is essentially any new debt that you can contract. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that since Zambia went into the common framework, it has not contracted any debt. And so essentially we can start with a clean slate. But before we start with a clean slate and before the IMF and the World Bank come with the bailout resources, we need to resolve the current debt issues that are on the table. Are we optimistic that that is going to be resolved? It has to be resolved. So one must be optimistic, but it is still this question around, and we, the African finance ministers are just writing a letter to the G20 saying we must restructure the common framework, re-engage with it differently. We're asking to move the common framework secretariat from Paris, which a little bit was the Paris Club conversation, maybe into the IMF or someplace else where we can have a much more multilateral conversation, but also maybe crowd in the private sector, because as it is right now, the conversations are very antagonistic between the private sector and the bilateral creditors, the new multilateral creditors and the new bilateral creditors. We need to find a space that is able to sort of bring those people together. We believe that it will happen. It's taking a little bit a lot longer than was expected, but I think it's also because the framework itself was not well designed. And so we need to change the framework, and we hope in the letter that we just sent to the G20, or are about to send in the next 2 hours to the G20, that this is one of the big issues that we can deal with. But an important thing, which I didn't mention in the presentation, is also that in the long term, again, what can you do to improve into the future, is really to begin to look at local currency borrowing and lending, beginning to develop capital markets. Because, as I said, monetary policy in the United States, immediately when you have interest rate tightening, with Zambia exposed to Eurobond creditors and commercial creditors and private creditors who are all borrowing to you either in euros or in dollars, makes all of your debt immediately more expensive. If Zambia was, borrowing in the Zambian kwacha, then you would not see this immediate increase because of the interest rate hikes and depreciation of your currency. So there is a lot more work, and this is what the Economic Commission for Africa is also trying to do, is to say, can we transform some of our debt into more local currency debt? The other thing that we're looking at is, of course, when you go to the bond markets today, bond market rates are very, very high. And bond market rates are high and tight. And so we're working on instruments like the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility to help countries reduce the cost of borrowing. But we can only reduce the cost of borrowing if you have good macroeconomic fundamentals. So if you don't have good macroeconomic fundamentals, your cost of borrowing, the markets will reflect your macroeconomic fundamentals to start with. The markets reflect three things: macroeconomic fundamentals. There is a certain degree of perception. We believe that about 178 basis points of Africa's cost of debt is perception. And then in some cases, about 200 basis points is a liquidity premium, which means we do not have sufficient capital market infrastructure to be able to recycle debt that is lent to the continent. The second thing, of course, is that we lend, as you saw, Zambia's sort of debt maturity levels, we're going to 3, 4, 5 years. Any kind of big infrastructure project takes 10 years, 12 years. If you're borrowing money that you need to pay in 3 years to build an infrastructure that you're going to build in 5 years, by definition, you're going to run into a debt problem. So these are the kinds of things that you need to start having conversations about and putting them in the public domain to see how you take them forward. Parliamentary oversight is important. I think works even better when you have social oversight and when audit, independent audit agency. I actually find it really, really telling that a lot of the questions that have come have been around how to make sure that we can stop, we can contain the problem. And this for me is essentially, I think, why we have the Young Economists Network. I go back to that, and why we have the university. Maybe one of the things that you want to do, and this is something we could work together on as the Young Economists Network, is look around the continent and see which countries have fiscal rules, and see whether Zambia can, as you're working on your debt management framework and or working to restructure. I think you talked about the government transparency law that is in Parliament, to see whether they reflect or they take some of the best examples of what we have. In West Africa, in the sort of West Africa monetary zone, they have some good fiscal rules, and it would be useful maybe to look there to see how they do it and what they're doing. South Africa, of course, is another country in point, but I think it would be good to compare and contrast a little bit what is the debt management framework in a number of countries compared to Zambia, and it will begin to give you a sense of maybe why Zambia got into the place it got into and how we can come out of it. I think on the question on what a foreign currency debt, yes, as long as we are not able to develop our own capital markets and use our own domestic currency debt, then we have to use external debt. But I must say that many countries issue local currency T-bills. The problem there also, and we don't talk about it enough, actually we don't talk about it nearly enough, and it is even more important to some extent, because that is the local currency debt market is essentially the market that also services our businesses. And so when the government is in arrears to the domestic private sector, it essentially means the government is shutting down the local private sector. So we do talk a lot about debt, external debt, which means we want to pay all of our external creditors. There is not nearly enough conversation, proof. I gave you a whole presentation without talking about domestic arrears in Zambia. And this is another area where we need to start looking. I don't know what the numbers are, and maybe again, in the room, we should look at that, is what are the domestic arrears in Zambia? It means the private sector is paying. It means the private sector cannot grow. It means that interest rates are high. And so again, you have this chicken and egg problem. If we're killing the domestic private sector, because rates are very high, because the government is not honoring its debt obligations to them, then they cannot reinvest in the economy, so the government is not getting taxes to pay the foreign debt. And so again, we need to work on that cycle. Bretton Woods institutions and structural adjustment policies. I think you've clearly seen that, in the last 15 years in Zambia, this has nothing to do with Bretton Woods institutions. Your debt profile is a totally different debt profile. It's more accountability of our governments and how we use the resources. I think that the structural adjustment we saw at the beginning of the 2000s, and then you saw the debt to GDP go to almost 10% because of HIPIC. So one can say that Bretton Woods institutions did their mea culpa, they did HIPIC, and they said, okay, let's give you a new start. We got the new start, and then we decided to go and find new creditors, more expensive creditors, more difficult creditors. But if you want to go to more expensive and more difficult creditors, then you have to be more diligent. And I don't think we've necessarily always done that. Some countries have done it and done it well on our continent as well. So there is examples of very good performance. I think at the end of the day, what you need is a good balance, a good mix of some private credit and some concessional credit to be able to do well. Debt servicing, acquiring debt. Yes, we have a lot of reprofiling or sort of new debt to service old debt. That is only good and effective if the new debt is cheaper than the old debt, right? But if you're paying more to service cheaper debt, then you're in trouble. But this always happens when you get into a sort of a debt overhang and a debt spiral. Then you find yourself, borrowing more to pay for today, and then tomorrow you have to borrow again to pay. And because the markets know that you need the resources, they essentially charge you more. They know you need the resources, but also the markets determine that the probability that you will not pay is high. So the cost of the resources is very high. So at some point, which is what Zambia has decided to do, which is the right thing, you should stop doing that and restructure your whole sort of debt basket. But I think what the international community needs to do for Zambia today is to give Zambia a framework within which it can do that in a timely manner.